By the time the beagle wearing the red bandana delivered the title deed in its mouth, like a courier from a better universe, my mother had already stopped crying about the old porch swing. The dog trotted up our new little house on a street with cracked sidewalks and pecan trees that dropped their secrets like coins, set the manila envelope at her sneakers, and blinked like a clerk at the county office. My mother said thank you to the dog because she was raised to say thank you to messengers, even when the message is absurd. I signed where the blue sticky flag told me to sign, and the notary who had followed the dog up the steps asked for a driver license and an extra signature on the line that said, Affidavit of Corrected Recording. It was a very American afternoon, which is to say it was tidy and entirely unbelievable. I will tell it backward, because that is how life feels when you survive it. We did not stage any lawn projectors. We did not gather the neighborhood for a verdict like a jury of folding chairs. We made a different kind of noise. We made paperwork rub against myth until both started to smoke. That is the entire flavor of this neighbor revenge. Start with the deed and walk back to the moment the porch swing squeaked, like a haunted violin telling us what was coming. His name was Beau Wheeler, which is what con men are named when a novelist wants to save time. He wore a golf shirt the color of toothpaste and white sneakers with a crease so sharp they could cut brisket. He lived across the cul-de-sac from my mother in North Dallas in a red brick house with 3 dormers like camera eyes, and he waved like a minister. After my father died, Beau learned the sound of her garage door and the rhythm of her grocery days and the exact softness of her voice when she confessed that she did not always know what to do after dinner. He brought over a bunitsa that he said came from a friend at church and a laminated handout about income from covered calls, which he said came from years of careful living. He said the market was a conversation and nobody listened as closely as people like us. The first time my mother lost money, Beau told her the loss was not real because she had not sold. The second time, he told her the loss was a teacher. The third time, he told her the loss was an opportunity. By the fourth time, the word loss had no meaning at all, the way a word said too often becomes a sound a parrot makes. He had her open a new account and put her house to work, which is what sharks call a home equity line of credit when they want to sound like motivational speakers. He texted her at 8 in the morning before she had her Louisiana iced teas and told her to buy a company that was about to change the way America ate protein. And she believed him because loneliness is a kind of hunger, and a man who sounds sure is a restaurant. You can imagine the foreclosure notice. You can imagine the constable who looked like a man who has practiced taking breaths that do not belong to him. You can imagine my mother sitting on the porch swing, touching the armrest like it was an old friend she had failed to protect. I drove up from Austin and sat in her kitchen at the table, where my father used to run his finger down the checkbook and swear at the price of gasoline as if it were a personal insult. I asked for logins and statements and the schedule of every text he had sent that began with the matter-of-fact word now. We could have gone loud. The homeowners association would have let me set up a microphone. The neighbors would have brought folding chairs and deviled eggs from the grocery store bakery. That is not the show I wanted to make. I did not want to become the man who built his identity out of a single speech. Revenge would be private and theatrical only in the way good signatures are theatrical. I wrote 3 lines on a yellow legal pad. We will pull a thread. We will let him hand us the scissors. We will not blink. Then I underlined neighbor revenge because that was the promise, and the title, and the keyword for a culture that only listens when you call it by its name. The first thread was a modest little thing with an eagle printed on it. The United States Postal Service protects mail with a fury that borders on romance. People think the real police wear tan or blue. Sometimes the real police wear navy blazers and investigate mailbox flyers that advertise investment education. I created a flyer with his market night language printed in the same cheerful font, and I included a little QR code in the corner that did not lead to him. It led to a page I built on a simple server with a very polite form that asked a person to register for the event and to provide a name and an address, and to click a box that said, I understand this is not investment advice. On the third day, a form came in from an email address that belonged to Beau under a different name. He tested his own funnel because salesmen cannot resist ordering their own product. That told me 2 things. He read his mail with an appetite. He trusted that nobody would trace appetite back to hunger. The second thread wore a cowboy hat. Texas has a thing about land, and about titles, and about who may say a chain of ownership out loud. I began signing up for free webinars that promised fast money in a way that sounded exactly like Beau sounded in my mother's kitchen. I learned a different language of protection from a woman in Lubbock who wore pearls and meant them like a warning. She said a person can file a notice of potential claim against a property if that person believes fraud or inducement contributed to a transaction that should not have happened. You do not lie to make a notice. You do not exaggerate. You simply place a flag in the dirt that says a conversation is ongoing and a buyer must step carefully. I placed the notice on the old house and on Beau's little rental property portfolio that he bragged about in backyard barbecue conversations. Titles began to look at him like a man who has touched a hot stove. That was not a flame, that was the memory of heat. The third thread smelled like a baseball field and popcorn and a little league outfield where fathers shout advice they never took. I started to coach a team because I needed to be around American chaos that did not lie to anyone. The coaches told me about a man they all used to know who sold timeshares by promising a view of the Gulf and delivered a view of a parking lot. The only way that man learned anything was when every small business owner in town stopped taking his checks the same week. I began to map a quiet refusal. The lawn company that sharpened his mower blades decided on a new policy. The mechanic who rotated his tires decided on cash at time of service. The church he visited to pass out donuts on Stewardship Sunday decided their donation table would prefer sealed boxes delivered by volunteers who did not have business cards. Nobody set a microphone up to announce anything. The sound was silence at scale. It is a national instrument. When the beagle showed up with the deed, it was the end of a ritual with steps that looked ludicrous when written down, but felt like breathing when lived. The notary put a seal down that said something had been corrected. The title company courier nodded at the dog, because it was a dog that had earned respect by taking its job very seriously. My mother asked if we could hang a new swing. I told her we would pick cedar and stainless steel chain, and we would learn to know the difference between a squeak and a song. I promised to tell the story, but I promised to tell it backward, so the aftertaste of victory would sweeten the memory of fear. That is the American way to lose and then win. It is a parade that begins at the end. It is a photograph that develops in reverse until the faces look familiar, and you remember that you were there. The Beagle messenger came from a woman named Gloria, who ran a private notary service out of a truck that used to belong to a traveling magician. I learned about her in a thread for people who still believe the phrase paper trail deserves the word trail. She said, "If you are going to make a story legal, make it interesting so that everyone involved stays awake." The dog was her flourish. The signatures were mine. Getting to those signatures required a carnival of details that brought out parts of America that remember how to be a town, and parts that pretend to be a town while selling something under the table. After the foreclosure notice, I moved my mother to Austin and set up a war room in my second bedroom with a whiteboard and a cheap ring light and a pot of coffee that made the apartment smell like the lobby of a courthouse. I mapped every text and transfer and whispered assurance that Beau had sent to my mother. I made a timeline on butcher paper with blue painter tape. When I stood back, it looked like a train track that curved toward a station named Absurd. I could run a finger along a Tuesday morning where he said, "Buy the fear," and find a Wednesday afternoon where my mother sold the winners to feed the losers. There was a clear slope, and the slope was downward, and the slope had his footprints and her footprints and the footprints of everyone who believes the market rewards faith. That is a church I have stopped attending. I needed 3 kinds of allies. The first was a clerk. Clerks run the American universe. They sit behind glass, and they tell a citizen what line to stand in. I went to the county office where documents get recorded in rooms that smell like toner and lemon cleaner and relief. I asked for the rules for a notice of potential claim. The woman at the counter gave me a look that meant I had asked the right question in the right tone. She told me about a form and a fee and a standard that required sincerity rather than certainty. The form was 3 pages, and the fee was less than dinner, and the standard was the standard I already believed in. Do not lie and stand behind your name. I prepared my packet. In that packet, I included the refinance papers and the home equity line of credit draw schedule, the copies of text messages in which Beau told my mother to size up like he was the owner of a gym, and a small essay about inducement written in the plainest English I could manage. I did not accuse anyone of a crime. I did not describe emotions. I described sequence. The clerk accepted the packet and stamped the receipt and told me that the notice would hit the chain. When a property wears a notice, it wears a small bell that rings in the ear of anyone who tries to move a title past it. That bell is not a siren. It is a dinner bell that says somebody should come and ask what is cooking before they eat. The second kind of ally was a neighbor, which seems obvious, except in America, neighbor is a word that behaves like fog. It gathers in the morning and disappears by noon. I walked the cul-de-sac and asked quiet questions. The retired band director showed me a spreadsheet that looked exactly like my mother's. The single parent who managed apartment buildings showed me a message that said, "Steady hands win," on a day the chart looked like a bad EKG. The elementary school teacher had a binder with printed emails tucked into sheet protectors like baseball boards. None of them wanted a show. Some of them wanted their money back. All of them wanted to feel smarter again. We built a list of refusals that would never get written down. It was the small town method. When a man buys donuts for a church with a credit card and his name tastes like metal, the usher quietly takes the card reader to the back and decides the machine is broken. When a man brings flyers to the coffee shop bulletin board, the barista thanks him warmly and forgets to staple. When a man calls for a handyman to fix a fence, every hammer in the area becomes mysteriously busy. You can call this petty. You can call it neighbor etiquette. I called it air because he needed it, and we took some of it away. The third ally wore the color of a conspiracy, and I will admit I enjoyed it. I created a phantom named the Neighborhood Oracle and gave that phantom a dog profile photo because dogs are trusted on the internet more than uncles. The Oracle posted on the local message board about casserole recipes and lost gloves and leaf blowers that start only when a man is trying to impress another man with a talk about yards. Every 8th post was a gentle question about free investment classes in garages. The Oracle told a short story about an aunt who lost a porch swing to a hot tip. The Oracle linked to the Texas State Investor Warning page in the way a grandparent hands you a hard candy with a wrapper crinkle that sounds like warning. The Oracle never said the name Bo. The Oracle asked about rules for home events offering products. The moderator pinned the thread as a community resource. In 2 weeks, a retired insurance lawyer posted a comment that said any financial education event should include a 24-hour cooling period before sign-up. 5 people hearted it. When the world says heart to a legal suggestion, a culture is changing without fanfare. Meanwhile, the silent paperwork kept moving. The lender who had sold my mother the home equity line of credit did not want trouble. I brought the binder to a downtown office where a manager wore a tie the color of a bruise and a face the shape of a man who practices apologies but never uses them. I showed him the sequence of texts from Bo and the draws from the line of credit and the way the timing made a shape that looked less like coincidence and more like choreography. He said words like policy and exception and workout like he was reading from a hymnal. By the end of the conversation, he had used the phrase fee waiver and the phrase fixed rate and the phrase long runway. He never admitted anything. He accepted gravity. Do not imagine that I did not feel rage. I felt it, and I let it do what it was built to do. Rage burns away everything that is not a plan. I stopped checking the message board to see if anyone had guessed what I was doing. I stopped rehearsing speeches in the shower. I started going to Little League practice and throwing grounders to boys who need to learn the hop. I started taking my mother to breakfast at the diner where the waitress calls every man honey and every woman sugar, and nobody means anything but kindness. We replaced his old language with the language of ordinary mercy. When we spoke about Bo in the kitchen, my mother called him the salesman, which is the most elegant insult in American English when a person has earned it. The dog with the red bandana was not a fantasy. The fantasy was that we would ever feel like this was over. America does not give you closure, it gives you the next thing to repair. The dog came up the steps with the envelope, and the notary set down her briefcase, and we completed something. We did not finish anything, but it was enough to make the swing sound like wood instead of a ghost. That is the most you can ask. That is the neighbor revenge I could say out loud in a church without washing my mouth afterward. The story turns strange now because that is where my country keeps its truth. When the paperwork started to smell like victory, the house began to talk. The voice did not come out of a wall like a haunted mansion. It came from the porch swing chains and the mailbox hinge and the vents that had swallowed my father's angry sighs when the Texas summer cooked the attic. The house did not ask for revenge. The house asked for balance. I had spent months thinking like a clerk and a coach and a ghost on a message board. The house wanted a different instrument. It wanted a song that sounded like a creed. I drove to the old cul-de-sac one midnight when the cicadas were making the noise that reminds you a planet is alive without asking your permission. I parked under the live oak that throws shade like a mother throws a blanket. I walked past the red brick with the 3 dormers, and I placed my palm on the column where the porch swing used to hang. The wood was warmer than the air. A train horn far off did that thing it does to the inside of your chest. I said the salesman's name out loud, and the name broke into syllables, and the syllables sounded like a promise that had gotten drunk and fallen down. Then the conspiracy began. The street light at the end of the cul-de-sac flickered twice like an old fluorescent in a high school hallway. A raccoon trotted across the asphalt, looked at me with human disappointment, and disappeared into a hedge like gossip. A window in the salesman's house glowed blue and then went dark, and then glowed again. I imagined him at his kitchen island, lifting a glass and setting it down and practicing an apology to the empty room. I imagined him swiping a phone screen. I imagined a text to a new lonely person, a draft that read, "You are a natural." I felt the house inhale. That is when I made a vow I had not planned to make. I felt ridiculous and completely sane. I promised the house that I would stop him from saying that sentence to anyone who had not already been hurt by it. I did not know how. I knew I would. The fantasy that followed is the only part I would tell in a courtroom with a smile. I started a club. It met in a back room at the public library, where the carpet is always brand new and the fluorescent lights buzz like insomnia. I called it the Jane Street Book Club to make finance people think of a place in Manhattan, and regular people think of a woman who could bake. The only rule of the club was no stock charts on paper, no tickers in the air, and every tale must be ordinary. People showed up with casseroles and losses that had numbers in the hundreds and losses that had numbers in the hundreds of thousands. They set their sadness in the middle of the table like a potluck. Nobody applauded. We listened. Then we told jokes. The jokes were gentle and mean in the American way, where the meanness is saved for the con and the gentleness is saved for the mark. An old rancher told a story about a man who tried to sell him a timeshare in a barn. A school librarian told a story about a woman who tried to sell her a candle that burns debt. We laughed until the fluorescent lights seemed softer. Then we wrote a pledge, not a committee pledge, not a resolution. A personal vow on a scrap of paper that said, "I will not take advice that asks me to act inside the next hour." We all signed. We folded the paper once and tucked it in our wallets next to driver licenses and photos of children. I began leaving these little vows in places where hurried men pause. I left one in a barbershop magazine. I tucked one under a windshield wiper in the parking lot of a store that sells smokers and pellet grills. I pinned one to the corkboard in a hardware store between a flyer for gutter cleaning and a lost cat. None of that was illegal. All of it was a sermon a town preaches to itself when a pulpit is not available. The salesman noticed in the way salesmen notice when the air cools a degree. His market nights moved to a new address 2 neighborhoods over, and then to the back room of a church he had not previously visited. The turnout was a handful of hopefuls and 2 men who wore the same boots and work pants as the men who had attended my book club, and who asked patient questions about licenses and suitability standards and whether the word education included the words specific and today. The salesman began to sweat through his toothpaste-colored shirt. The church asked him to leave. I never called the Securities and Exchange Commission. Other people did. I did not file a civil suit. Other people did. My revenge lived in the places where America still speaks in whispers that carry. The realtor who called my mother Han during the open house leaned across a counter at a coffee shop and told a couple considering an offer that they might want to know about a notice of potential claim, and a conversation with a lender who said fixed rate and fee waiver with an unusual degree of kindness. The couple picked a different house. The salesman tried to sell the rental he bragged about to a man who restores old trucks, and the man who restores old trucks said he liked his titles clean. The salesman drove home past our old house and did not look left. The street light flickered once like a wink. We did one grand thing that felt like a myth, and it was as lawful as a recipe. The Jane Street Book Club launched a fake guru. We called him the Betsy Ross algorithm because he mended the national cloth and wore a baseball cap with a flag patch and posted videos where he baked a pie and spoke in a soft voice about how money is quieter when it is earned slowly. His advice was so boring it sounded like punishment. Bake your pie, pay your rent. Leave the money you will need within 6 months in a place you could access in a storm. He never said the name of a company. He never said a day of the week. And yet his videos made more sense than any man in a garage. People in our zip code sent the videos to their parents and their cousins and their barber. I have never loved a lie so much. It was a lie that protected the truth. It was neighbor revenge that made the town sweeter. When the beagle arrived with the deed, I almost told the dog this whole part of the story. The dog looked like a man who already knew and preferred silence. The notary patted its head, my mother put water in a dish, and the chain on the new swing creaked in a way that sounded like a laugh. I promised to tell it backward, and I will keep that promise. After the deed came the phone call that felt like a final chord. It did not announce a prison sentence. It did not announce a lawsuit had ended. It announced something both smaller and larger. It announced that the salesman had moved away. The real estate agent in charge of the red brick house called the Jane Street Book Club line, which still lived on a prepaid phone that we kept in a drawer with spare batteries and a tape measure. The agent said a short sentence in a professional voice that made room for mercy. The sentence was, "He signed a consent agreement and left town." No headline, no parade, no microphone, a signature and a rented truck and a very long drive. Before that call, we had a meeting with a banker who had the power to grant a mortgage grace, and he chose to exercise that power like a man who believes in the future tense. He turned the floating rate into a fixed rate, and he called past penalties a misunderstanding that changed shape under examination. He did not use the word restitution. He referred to it as a correction. I learned to love that word. I loved it more than revenge. I loved it because it meant a train track laid wrong could be pulled up and set down again so that a train carrying a woman's life would arrive where it was meant to arrive. Before the banker, there was a podcast episode that did not become a true crime sensation and did not pay anyone's rent and did not change the law. It changed a room. A host with a warm voice asked my mother what she missed most about the old house. And my mother said that she missed the way the porch light made a circle on the lawn, like a stage where the neighbor kids put on a show of nothing in particular. The host stayed quiet for a full 5 seconds, which is an eternity on a recording. Then she whispered that she, too, had a circle of porch light in a town that no longer remembers porch circles. The episode ended with the sound of a door closing very gently. People wrote to say they had paused the episode under a tree and cried and then called their parents to say hello. I count that as a victory that cannot be measured. It is a kind of interest that compounds without charts. Before the podcast, the Jane Street Book Club wrote a letter to itself. We agreed that no one would take up a microphone in a public square to shame anyone by name. We agreed that no one would go to the salesman's new address and attach a banner to any of his fences, and that no one would write an anonymous letter, and we all agreed that we would choose the quieter path that smells like ink. We would file notices, we would register concerns, we would write to editors with stories that have receipts. We would stop telling certain kinds of jokes around men who love to hear their own voice. We would not become the thing we hate. We would become the town again. Earlier still was a morning at the beaver-themed gas station on the highway between Austin and Dallas, where America goes to eat candy and buy brisket and use restrooms that feel like hotel lobbies. I stood in front of a wall of jerky and decided that shame is for people who do not know what to do next, and dignity is for people who have a list. I bought a fountain drink and a bag of ice, and I drove to my mother's temporary apartment, and we filled her freezer, and we made a list that included call the clerk, call the lender, call the neighbor whose truck says he can fix anything. We turned revenge into a to-do list. We turned grief into a rule about not answering texts that ask for action inside an hour. We turned the word neighbor from fog into brick. If I tell it forward for a moment, because I cannot resist the luxury of a straight line, I will say this. The man who called my mother a natural will someday try to sell something else to someone else in a town that does not know his name. He will stand at a counter, and he will smile like a minister, and he will speak like a coach, and he will make fluff sound like doctrine. I cannot save that town. I can only save ours. In our town, the bulletin board at the coffee shop has a new little sign. The sign reads, Community Standard for Money Talks. It says that any event that includes detailed strategy or refers to any product that could move money must include proof of license and a 24-hour cooling period. It says that if a presenter uses the words now or today as a command more than once, a person may raise a hand and say, slow down. Now, the sign is printed on plain paper and laminated in the way school teachers laminate things, and it is held to the cork with 4 thumbtacks. If you squint, the thumbtacks look like a constellation. I end where I began. The beagle with the red bandana tipped his head and stared at the new swing like a critic assessing theater. The notary put away her metal seal. The title deed smelled like toner and victory, and nothing of blood. My mother asked me if I hated the salesman. I told her I did not. I told her I hated the sentence he gave her more than the man. I told her I hated the sentence, "You are a natural," when spoken by a stranger who planned to turn a lonely woman into a capital base. I told her I loved a different sentence more. The sentence was this: "You are allowed to be loved without being valuable to anyone's strategy." She said that sentence out loud, and then she laughed in the way American women laugh when a weight comes off the chest. It is a sound that could carry a town square by itself. It is a sound that turns the porch light into a stage again. This is the neighbor revenge I will teach my children if I have them. You make a list. You bake a pie. You go to practice and catch grounders, and you return the text that says hello, and you ignore the text that says now. You trust clerks, and you pay notaries. You choose a swing, and you listen for the squeak that tells you a ghost has left the porch. When you feel the desire to shout, you sit down and you write a letter on paper. When a salesman says you are a natural, you remember that you already are, but not for the reason he suggests. Then you feed the dog, because the dog has delivered the deed, and that kind of messenger deserves a bowl that is more than half full.